Okay, well, we're going to get started in just 10, 9, 8, 7. Just a few. Here we go. Years and years and years ago, I don't know how many years, I remember listening to a John MacArthur sermon. Don't even remember which sermon it was, but in this sermon, he was talking about a conference he had given in Russia shortly after the Iron Curtain opened for such things. He relates that he was giving a series of teachings about the church, and after a couple days, the leadership came to him and said they appreciated what he was teaching, but they wondered when he was going to get to the good stuff. Their hearts, who had been through so much through communist Russia, wanted to hear about the good stuff. John MacArthur was confused as he said he thought he was preaching some good stuff. After a few questions, he learned they wanted to hear about heaven. They wanted to hear about life after this life. They wanted to hear the good stuff. That story came to my mind when looking at our next passage in John 14, verses 2 to 3. It says, "In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. For I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." I consider this passage to most definitely be the good stuff. And while our book tackles it in 3 chapters, I want to take it as a whole. You will also find, if you're reading the book, that I'm taking a slightly different path than our author, Martin Lloyd-Jones. You see, while Martin Lloyd-Jones sees this passage as strictly a reference to the second coming of Jesus, I take the view, along with John MacArthur and others who are much wiser than I, that this is actually a passage that hints strongly at the rapture of the church. And I am also really excited because I just recently learned several new truths. The truths were not new, but the information was for me new. This new information I learned has a direct bearing on these verses, and I'd like to share that with you, as I believe it will be encouraging and timely to our circumstances. So, here we go. New to me stuff. Did you know that Jesus spent most of his life and ministry in Galilee, and that all of the disciples except for Judas was also from Galilee? Did you realize that Galilee is not where Jerusalem was? I didn't. The region of Galilee is north, Judea, where Jerusalem is south, and Samaria is smack dab in the middle. The walk between the Sea of Galilee, or the region of Capernaum, was a little more than 75 miles, or 3 to 4 days' walk if one was traveling 20 miles a day. I didn't know that. I did not realize that the majority of Jesus' time in ministry was in the region of Galilee. Having never visited Israel or really thinking about such things, I just mushed all of these locations together into one space. I thought it was like, well, for me locally, like the difference between Tulsa and Broken Arrow and Jinx. Just kind of neighborhoods in the same town. And for a person like me that has had the mobility of cars in her whole life, the distance between these towns is what, at best 10 to 30 minutes, depending on traffic, which is not that much now. I can even drive from Tulsa to Oklahoma City in 1 hour and 45 minutes and not be in danger of a speeding ticket. And that distance is still about 20 miles farther than the distance Jesus had to walk from Capernaum to Jerusalem. While understanding that there were no cars in ancient Israel, I still had not seen that in my understanding of the life and times of Jesus and his disciples. What I miss that is significant in my understanding is that while Jesus was a Jew, he was also a Galilean. His disciples were Galilean, and this played a part in the teachings and parables of Jesus. Jesus taught using cultural references that would be familiar to his audience. The most significant being Jesus' several references to weddings, to Jesus being a bridegroom, to the church being his bride, and even references to his Father's house. Let's explore what archaeologists and historians have discovered about Galilean culture and traditions. I think you will find this as fascinating as I did. The people of Galilee usually lived in what is called an insula. These were clusters of buildings where extended families lived together. These clusters were built around a central courtyard. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins all lived and interacted in the insula. When his son got married, he would build new rooms onto his father's house as a place for he and his new bride to live. As you are familiar from the story of Joseph and Mary, a Jewish wedding would actually start with a betrothal. This betrothal was a written contract between the bride and the groom's family. In a Galilean betrothal, the families would meet in a public place where there would be many witnesses to this contract. The contract would be read and the bride price would be agreed on. This dowry was not so much a payment for the bride as it was an insurance policy to protect the bride in case something were to happen to her husband. After the contract and the dowry had been agreed, there was another tradition followed by the Galileans during the betrothal ceremony. The groom-to-be would pour a glass of wine into a ceremonial cup called the cup of joy and offer it to the bride. Unlike other cultures at the time, in the Galilean culture, the woman had the power to push the cup away and refuse the offer. She had to be a willing participant. If she accepted the marriage proposal, she would take the cup and drink from it. At that moment, she was referred to as one who was bought with a price. Then she would hand the cup back to the groom and he would drink. Then he would say loud enough for all to hear, "You are now consecrated to me by the laws of Moses, and I will not drink of this cup again until I drink it anew with you in my Father's house." Yeah, I know. You've heard those words before. Just hold those thoughts. We'll get there. After the betrothal contract was, as we say, signed, sealed, and delivered, the groom would go back to his father's house and begin building new rooms onto that house. The bride would go to her home, and she and her bridesmaids would begin to prepare herself, her wedding dress, and anything else she would need for the day of her groom's return. It was important that the bride begin her preparations immediately, for she did not know exactly when her groom would return. And this is really cool. Only the father of the groom knew what day the son would go to pick up his bride. You see, when the son was finished with his building project, he had to wait until the father gave approval to the building project. Then he would have to wait still more until his father gave him permission to go and get his bride. Meanwhile, the bride is waiting with her bridesmaids for the groom's return. But let's face it, society may not have had Facebook, but the bride would know some town chatter about the state of her groom's building project. By the time her groom had finished his room, she is most likely sleeping in her wedding clothes. At the time he thought it perfect, the father would give his approval to his son to go and get his bride. At this point, the groom's wedding party, his family, the best man, and any groomsmen would travel to get his bride. This entourage would travel blowing a shofar, a trumpet-type instrument, to let everyone know that the wedding day had arrived. The groom was coming for his bride. The bride and her maids would hear the trumpet blast and light their lamps, because usually this event would happen in the evening, and go out to meet the groom and his party when they arrived. I don't know about you, but is your mind racing? Are you seeing this connection? These are so exciting. Now the bride did not have to walk back to the groom's home. She was lifted and carried up and taken to the rooms that the groom had built on a litter. In the culture, carrying the bride was called flying the bride away. When they arrived at the home that had been prepared for her, the bride and groom entered. The door was shut. The best man stood guard outside the door, and after the marriage was consummated, he would announce that the couple was married, and the 7-day reception, or the marriage supper, would begin. I'm sure by now you're seeing it. Jesus used the customs of Galilee, things that his disciples would have been intimately familiar with, to describe the relationship between Jesus and the church. The teachings and parables of Jesus were not vague, hidden references. They were clear as could be to the men he was talking to. Let's back up a little bit and look at some scriptures in light of what we now know about the Galilean wedding traditions and what Jesus told his disciples in John 14, 2-3. Let's look first at Mark 14, verses 23 to 25. This event was happening at the Last Supper. And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly, I say to you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." Our study verse in John 14:2 says, "In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you." Realize that for those who have accepted Jesus' proposal, he is currently in his Father's house preparing a place for you, and a place for me, and a place for each and every one that has accepted Jesus, who, by the way, bought us with a price. It references in 1 Corinthians 6:20. The Lord is preparing a place for us. And here I would like to quote from Charles Spurgeon's sermon titled, "A Prepared Place for a Prepared People." And this is Charles Spurgeon. "If Christ is preparing heaven, then it will be what our Scotch friends call a bonny place. And if it be prepared for us, when we get there, it will exactly fit us. It will be the very heaven we wanted, a better heaven than we ever dreamed of, a better heaven than we ever pictured, even when our imagination took its loftiest flights. The heaven of God, and yet a heaven exactly suited to such happy creatures as we then shall be." Like Charles Spurgeon and the rest of those who think on such things, neither do I know what our rooms will be like in the Father's house. But I do know it will be more than able to hold all of us, and it will not be cramped. Let's look ahead in our journey. Revelation chapter 21, verses 15 to 21. For it is my contention that this is a description of our Father's house, where our rooms are located. Revelation chapter 21, starting at verse 15. "The one who spoke with me had a gold measuring rod to measure the city and its gates and its walls. The city is laid out as a square, and its length is as great as its width. And he measured the city with a rod, 1,500 miles. Now I looked, in 1,500 miles, if you look at the United States, from the Canadian border to the Mexican border is 1,500 miles. And then it says its length and width and height are equal. Now, most people can assume that this is a cube, its length and width and height being equal, so that the city is shaped like a cube. There are a few that think it could be shaped like a triangle, or not a triangle, a pyramid, because you would still have its length and width, and the height could still be equal. It doesn't matter. It's going to be cool, whichever it is. Probably a cube. And he measured its wall 72 yards according to human measurements. Now, 72 yards is 3/4 of a football field. Because if a football field is 100 yards across, then 72 is almost 3/4 of the length of a football field. The material of the wall was jasper, and the city was pure gold, like clear glass. The foundation stones of the city wall were adorned with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation stone was jasper, the second sapphire, the third chalcedony, the fourth emerald, the fifth sardonyx, the sixth sardius, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, the 12th amethyst, and the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each one of the gates was a single pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. I believe that this city, currently in heaven, is the building results of the cumulative rooms that Jesus has prepared for those he is coming back for. It will have more than enough rooms, large rooms, very large rooms. Look at Google some of the thoughts of people about just how big this structure is. Jesus has prepared rooms for us in the Father's house. And because I'm sure his disciples were sitting there with their mouths hanging open in utter shock at what he was hearing, Jesus tells them, and I'm using a paraphrase here, no, really, look, it's true. If it wasn't, I would have told you, but it's true. I am leaving so that I can prepare a room for you in my Father's house. And then he says something equally as amazing. I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And here, I believe, is the Bible's first New Testament hint at the rapture of the church. For the purpose of this lesson, I don't have time to develop an apologetic for the belief in the rapture. For clarity, I will mention that I am a firm believer in a pre-tribulation rapture. That at some point in time, it could be while we're watching this video, or it could be 100 years from now, or, although I don't actually believe that, or it could actually be even longer or that, but I believe it's a lot sooner than that. But anyway, at some point, a point in time that only the Father knows, as Jesus tells us in Matthew 24:36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Just like the Galilean wedding, only the Father knows the exact time he will send his Son for his bride. And I say exact time, for even in Bible times there would have been a knowledge that the time was near. As I mentioned before, the Son would have finished the rooms, the feast food would have been acquired, the bride would have made herself ready by creating her trousseau. Everyone would have known the approximate timing, but only the Father knew the exact day and hour of the event. The second and main reason that I believe this is a rapture passage is that in the rapture, believers are taken up into the air to meet Jesus. This is clear in 1 Thessalonians 4:16-18. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. So the rapture has the saints going up. This is an entirely different event from the second coming of Christ, which happens at the end of the tribulation. At the second coming, we won't be traveling up to meet Jesus. We will be coming back down. We will be riding with Jesus back to earth. We will have already experienced the Bema Seat judgment and the wedding supper of the Lamb. At the second coming, we are sitting on white horses, clothed in fine white linens, as is mentioned in Revelation 19:7-8. It says, "Let us rejoice and be glad and give glory to him, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was given to her to clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints." So we get our fine linen, bright and clean, for the marriage supper of the Lamb, which happens before the second coming. At the second coming, we are following behind the Lord, the King, the Conqueror, the Christ, who is coming in judgment, as is pictured in Revelations 19:11-14. End I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and wages wars. His eyes are a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written on him which no one knows except himself. He is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him on white horses. Now, let's go back and tie this all together. Think about the description of the Galilean wedding traditions as we look at the events and words of Jesus. Jesus shares a cup with his disciples. He tells them this is a cup representing a new covenant. He tells them he is going away, but that he is doing this so he can build them a new home in his Father's house. He tells them that he will return to take them to that place so that where he is, and he is currently not on earth, he is currently in his Father's kingdom in heaven, that where Jesus is right now, there we will be with him, and that we will be with him forever and ever. There is no divorce in heaven. Once you are a bride of Christ, once you have accepted his offer of salvation, you are a bride forever. Our previous passage in 1 Thessalonians 4:18 ended with, comfort one another with these words. And John tells us, do not let your heart be troubled. Jesus is preparing a place for his bride. He will return and claim that bride. He has already paid the price for her. He said he was coming back. That makes the statement true, unchanging, and final fact. If we die first, there will still be a room that was prepared for us, and we will be in his presence that much sooner. Remember, he told the thief, thou shalt be with me in paradise. If we live until he comes for his church, we escape the wrath of God's judgment that is coming. We rejoice in joy that we have a table of honor at the marriage supper of the Lamb. As Jesus said, fear not, let not your heart be troubled. And I hope that that was as fun for you as it was for me as I learned all of these associations that I had never put together before of the marriage supper, the bride references, the Father's house, and Jesus coming back for his bride. I just thought was really cool. So that covers, well, at least the way I'm doing it, we'll cover chapters 4, 5, and 6 of our book.